Welcome to Two Keto Dudes Fix Diabetes, Part 1.
Hi, I'm Richard Morris from Canberra, Australia, and I've been on a ketogenic diet for 3 years. When I started, I was very sick with complications from type 2 diabetes. And within 6 months of starting a ketogenic diet, all of my biomarkers of disease had disappeared. I've lost about 80 pounds and I've completely turned my health around.
Hi, I'm Carl Franklin from New London, Connecticut in the United States. And in February 2016, I put myself on a ketogenic diet to take control of my metabolism. In just 2.5 months, I managed to reverse all my markers of type 2 diabetes with diet alone. As of now, I'm 80 pounds lighter with no signs of diabetes or heart disease.
We're not doctors, we can't give any medical advice. We just want to share what we did to reverse our type 2 diabetes and the science behind that.
And we have published a list of what we consider critical scientific research at science.2keto.com. And please read it if you have concerns, and please talk to your doctor before starting any change in diet and lifestyle.
Be prepared for your doctor to have little to no knowledge of and or experience with a ketogenic diet, but consider Dr. Eric Westman. He has treated over 4,000 type 2 diabetic patients using a ketogenic diet as the first therapy with a 100% success rate.
Absolutely. We're both software developers, so we're definitely not afraid of a little technical detail.
No, we are not. We actually went to the Alamo in San Antonio, Texas recently. We did a corporate presentation. In fact, we did 2 corporate presentations, and we tested our audience's blood before the presentation. So we knew how many were type 2 diabetic, pre-diabetic, how many were normal, and how many were healthy, which is not quite the same thing as normal. And we're ready to do that same presentation to any corporate group.
And that's why we're making this video, so that you can see what we did there, and maybe we can do it for you too.
That's right. So I'm going to make the case for a hidden epidemic of type 2 diabetes that reaches San Antonio. 29 million Americans have diabetes. 8 million of those don't know that they have diabetes. 2.2 million Texans have diabetes, and 440,000 of those don't know that they have diabetes. And in Bexar County alone, which is where San Antonio is, 137,000 people have diabetes. And between 30 and 45% of Americans also have pre-diabetes, which means they're on the path to type 2 diabetes. Most of these people will die from complications of diabetes, including cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, diabetic retinopathy, which is blindness, or diabetic neuropathy, which is lower extremity amputations.
Nasty stuff.
Nasty.
So the U.S. population with diagnosed diabetes from 1958 to 2015 looks like this. It's a pretty steep curve.
It certainly is. It starts out with roughly 1% of people have type 2 diabetes, and by 2015, over 7.1% of people have type 2 diabetes, and an additional number of people have undiagnosed diabetes. It's something like 9.5% of people in 2015 in the USA had type 2 diabetes, whether they were diagnosed or not. So this map shows you the age-adjusted prevalence of diagnosed diabetes amongst US adults over a 15-year period. And you can see that Texas starts with under 4.5% of people are diabetic. And by the end of the 15 years, over 9% of people in Texas are diabetic.
So you might be asking yourself, what do a couple of software developers know about diabetes? Why are all these programmers and engineers jumping on the bandwagon to figure this stuff out?
Right. Well, there's a couple of reasons. The first reason is that Carl and I are both type 2 diabetics, so it was a personal interest to us to find out what is happening and to try and turn it around. Secondly, doctors are trained to treat symptoms with treatments. Engineers, however, are trained to seek out the root cause, to debug the process, to find out where the inputs went wrong or where the process between input and output went wrong, to try and find out what's happening.
Exactly what we do when we sit down to write code. We do a lot of debugging, and we try to find the root cause of problems.
Yeah.
And you have an analogy about if a doctor was fixing a spreadsheet.
That's right.
Yeah. If the spreadsheet was off by $3, the doctor would fix it by subtracting $3 or adding $3. But an engineer would try to find out what caused the math problem in the first place.
That's right. And fix the problem so that every time you ran the spreadsheet, you could rely on the results. So you might be interested in the rate of diabetes prevalence worldwide, which is roughly 8.5%. So 8.5% of human beings have type 2 diabetes. In the USA, that number is 9.4%. In Texas alone, it's 10.8%. And in San Antonio, it's 14.2%.
Big.
Big difference. And when we did our presentation in San Antonio, we knew that how many people in the room had type 2 diabetes. It was only 5%, but this was a population that skewed young. These were mostly young people working for a technology startup in their 20s and 30s. Most of them were still probably insulin sensitive to a certain degree. Whereas as you get older, you become more and more insulin resistant. And by the time that you get to 60, at least 50% of people in San Antonio who were 60 and above had type 2 diabetes.
And not only that, but as you'll see in the numbers that we present, just because only 5% of people in the room had full-blown diabetes doesn't mean the rest of them weren't at risk. The majority of them were at risk, and we're going to show how.
Yeah. If we actually have a look at a number called prediabetes, this is people who are on the road to diabetes. You'll see in the USA, 33.9% of Americans have prediabetes. In Texas, it's actually smaller. Only 33% of people have prediabetes, which probably talks to the fact that Texas is better at diagnosing people who have type 2 diabetes. In San Antonio, the number is 32%. In this room that we did our presentation to, the number of people who had prediabetes was 34%.
And prediabetes is just what the medical professionals consider you're in the danger zone. And again, as you'll see, many more of them were.
So why is this diabetes epidemic happening? Well, there are two hypotheses for it. The first is the calories in, calories out hypothesis. And that is basically that too much food, gluttony, and not enough exercise, sloth, is causing the problem. In other words, the explanation is that this is a moral crisis. People get fatter, they become sicker, and they eventually get diabetes. That's the traditional theory.
Yeah, it's also convenient for doctors because they don't have to take responsibility for what they tell you to do. They tell you to eat less and exercise more, and if you don't do it, it's your failing. And so the end result is the majority of people walk around feeling guilty just for being human and having the desire for food and no desire to exercise. And this cartoon is a perfect example of how the calories in, calories out hypothesis is not a cause. We're engineers. We want to find causes, but it's an effect. It's an observation. So you can see the plumber is looking to find the problem here, and he says, oh, I see what the problem is. There's more water going into the toilet than going down the drain. Therefore, you have a puddle on your floor.
Right.
Gee, thanks, genius. Doesn't explain anything. The real problem is maybe a clog.
That's the root cause.
That's the root cause.
What engineers are trained to go after. The other hypothesis is what's known as the hormonal model. And here, the hypothesis goes that you make insulin when you eat sugar or starch, and large amounts of insulin make some of us resistant to us. And then we have to make more and more insulin to deal with the same amount of food. And eventually we can't make enough insulin and our blood glucose goes out of control. In other words, we're eating food that makes us slowly derange over decades, which causes us to gain weight. So there's a paradox of the overweight, hungry man who has no energy. And this is adequately explained by the second hypothesis, but not the first. The second hypothesis, the insulin hypothesis, explains this by explaining that high insulin locks energy in fat cells. This prevents your cells from accessing the energy that you have stored to be able to burn it. Insulin resistance prevents you from using glucose for energy, so now you have two sources of energy that you don't have access to, so no energy is available despite having plenty stored in body fat.
So as an example or a thought experiment, I could follow a healthy person around who eats 2,000 calories a day and burns 2,000 calories a day
Right.
With a shot of insulin. Every time that person reached for some food, I'm going to give them some insulin, just like what we do to our diabetic patients. And this story comes right out of Robert Lustig's series on YouTube.
Yes.
Basically, insulin's job is to convert glucose that's in the blood to fat. It takes sugar out of the bloodstream, converts that energy to fat in storage. Okay, that's what insulin does.
It also takes fat out of the blood and pushes it into fat cells for storage. Insulin's job is to clear the decks so that you can metabolize glucose.
Right. So you eat 2,000 calories. I'm going to inject you with insulin. Right off the top, 500 of those calories get taken out for energy and stored as fat. So now you have weight gain, and you don't have enough energy because you're 500 calories shy of what you need to feel good.
That's right.
And so you get tired, you don't feel like exercising, and hungry. And so what do? You probably eat some more, and give you some more insulin, and we take a little bit more off the top that way. So as you can see, it starts this roller coaster.
Yeah. And the longer you go with this, the worse you get. So I'll give you the difference between a type 2 diabetic and a non-diabetic. So a normal person with a normal response eats a little bit of glucose, they get a small blip of insulin, their glucose comes back down again, and they go back to their stasis. Low amount of insulin, normal amount of glucose in their blood. Okay. A type 2 diabetic, they eat a little bit of glucose or some food that turns into glucose. They get a massive insulin response, but it's slow acting. It doesn't act on the glucose fast enough. So the pancreas makes more and even more insulin, and eventually you overcorrect. The glucose goes below the level that the body is happy with, and this is, we call this hangry.
Yeah, you've heard of hangry. Yeah.
Type 2 diabetics make too much insulin. We make more insulin to deal with the same amount of food. We make it for longer. Sometimes we overcorrect and our glucose goes too low, and that causes us to need to eat again. And that puts us on what we like to call the glucose roller coaster.
Exactly.
It's technically known as reactive hypoglycemia, but basically it means 2 hours after eating, you want to eat again because your blood sugar has already gone too low. And we spend the day chasing normal glucose.
Never really getting it.
That's right. So why does insulin matter to a type 2 diabetic? Well, I showed you the insulin graph for a normal person. They make a little blip of insulin, their glucose goes down, their insulin goes back to the low level. For a type 2 diabetic, their insulin is always high. It's high even when they don't eat anything. And when they do eat something, insulin goes even higher for a very long time, and then it takes a long time to come down. And the area under the curve is the total amount of insulin exposure that person has had. And you can see that for a type 2 diabetic, their exposure to insulin is significantly higher for exactly the same food as a non-diabetic. So why is insulin exposure a problem? Well, you may have heard that diabetics have a 4-fold increase in cardiovascular disease, and I think I can explain that in just 3 studies. So the first study I want to introduce you to is Cruz et al. 1961. This was a study where scientists made dogs diabetic using a chemical called allotoxin. It's a fake glucose that basically blows up their pancreas and they can no longer make insulin. So we're making dogs type 1 diabetic, and then we have to give the dogs insulin for them to survive for any amount of time. So in this experiment, they gave the dogs insulin in one femoral artery. That is an artery in the groin that goes down the leg and feeds the leg. Then the blood comes back via venous return to the central system and then out through the remainder of the periphery. So what that means is that the insulin that's going into that one femoral artery is mostly concentrated in that one leg. And guess what they did? They made dogs with cardiovascular disease in just one leg. This is showing that insulin exposure is sufficient for heart disease. And there are 2 studies that show that insulin exposure is necessary for heart disease. And these are Cook et al. In 53 and Duff et al. In 54. And they were both studies using rabbits. Now, rabbits are a really good model for human atherosclerotic progression. So the first study, Cook et al. In 1953, what they did was they took 2 groups of rabbits. One was to be the control and the other was to be the intervention. And in the intervention, they made these rabbits diabetic, so they could not make any insulin. And then they treated both rabbits to the same stimulus that would cause atherosclerotic progression. Always happens in rabbits. You give them cholesterol to eat, and they become atherosclerotic.
Because they're herbivores, their systems are not used to processing dietary cholesterol.
Yeah, it's a very unusual thing to do to rabbits, but it always produces rabbits that have cardiovascular disease. So they did it, and guess what? The rabbits that they made diabetic by knocking out their pancreas from producing insulin were protected from developing cardiovascular disease. The rabbits who made normal insulin and were non-diabetic got cardiovascular disease, as you would expect. So the second study, Duff et al. In 1954, what they did was they then gave those rabbits who were protected from cardiovascular disease, they then gave them insulin, and guess what happened? They all got cardiovascular disease. This is showing that insulin is necessary for cardiovascular disease.
Sufficient and necessary.
That's right. So insulin exposure to humans is a direct cause necessary and sufficient for cardiovascular disease. So how do we measure how much insulin we have? Well, insulin pulses. It goes up and down every 6 minutes. And any discrete measurement that you make of it could be off by as much as 70%. Fasting insulin doesn't really measure your engine while it's running. It's like measuring your engine when it's up on blocks. And there are some tests like the Kraft insulin assay that will measure your glucose status and insulin status while you're responding to a glucose challenge. But there is actually probably an easier way to get at your exposure to insulin, and that is working out what your average exposure to glucose was, because as we know, when we have glucose in our blood, our pancreas makes insulin. Mm-hmm. So there is actually a measurement called the HbA1c. It's an average of glucose in the blood over 3 months. It measures how sugar-coated your red blood cells are. So an HbA1c averages glucose exposure over 3 months. And you can see from our slide, we've got the HbA1c number at the top, and on the bottom you can see the US and SI values for glucose exposure. It's actually an estimated average glucose exposure. So if you were to test your glucose every 5 minutes for roughly 3 months, and your glucose averaged 126, then your HbA1c would be roughly 6%. So HbA1c is also used for diagnosing diabetes. A normal person has an HbA1c under 5.6%. So their exposure to glucose is under 5.6%. A pre-diabetic person has an HbA1c between 5.7 and 6.4. And a fully type 2 diabetic's HbA1c, their exposure to insulin over 3 months, is 6.5 and above. So you can see the diagnostic ranges here, normal pre-diabetes and diabetes. So the standard of care, this is how we treat type 2 diabetics. We medicate them to 7.0%.
And that's diabetic.
Exactly. We're actually medicating people to a state of diabetes because if we were to aim for a lower number, there's a chance that we actually may push them too low.
Because the drugs are very powerful and you could go into a hypoglycemic diabetic coma.
Exactly.
This, Richard, is perhaps my favorite slide because that little no turnaround or the point of no return is a wake-up call, and it really was for the people in San Antonio.
Yeah. This basically is the point on the HbA1c above which you are killing off your beta cells that make insulin faster than you can make new ones. And below that point, you're able to grow them faster than glucose toxicity is killing them off. And that point is roughly 5.5% HbA1c. If you're below that, you're fine. If you're above that, you're slowly getting worse. And the further you are above that, the faster you are getting worse.
That's right. And that's why they call diabetes, type 2 diabetes, a progressive disease that only gets worse. It doesn't get better.
Because you can see where we're medicating people to. We're medicating people to 7.
So as you can see, once you get above 5.4, you're on the slippery slope toward diabetes.
That's exactly right. So where did we start this journey? Well, Carl's apex, his highest HbA1c, was 7.5%. And mine was 11.2%. And now you can see why I drew that chart up to 11. I was a lot sicker than Carl. Even though I wasn't as heavy as he was, I was significantly sicker. And if we actually have a look at the audience in San Antonio that we did our presentation to, we showed them exactly where they sat on this graph.
Right. And so you can see that there's a very small percent that are full-blown diabetic, but most of them are hovering around that point of no return, around that 5.4, 5.5.
Yeah.
And it turned out 52% of the people in the room were over that line.
And a lot of them didn't know about it, and a lot of their doctors didn't know about it, because if you look at that histogram that we've got there, the people in red are the people who would be officially pre-diabetic, and their doctors would know they're in trouble. The people in pink are on the bad side of the point of no return, but they're officially normal glucose. Their doctors aren't aware that they are getting worse. So let's look at some of the complications of diabetes. Now, we have some data from the UK Prospective Diabetes Survey, and they have data relating to deaths related to diabetes based on HbA1c, and they only go up to 10. So let's use Carl's data for this. When Carl was first diagnosed with diabetes at 7.5, his chance of dying from a cause related to diabetes was 2 times somebody whose HbA1c was normal, 5.5 or less. Carl's chance of a myocardial infarct or a heart attack when he was first diagnosed at 7.5 is roughly 1.5 times that of a normal person. And his chance of an amputation at 7.5 was roughly 2 times that of somebody who had normal glucose. Now, you'll see that at 11, I'm right off the chart. So something you may not know about me, when I first started looking for a root cause of my diabetes, I had a problem. I had a toenail that started out being an ingrown toenail and had gone septic, and my doctor told me, he looked in my eyes and he said, if you can't lower your glucose and get your glucose in control, and I don't think you can, that toe may have to come off. And that was a wake-up call. That's what got me started doing this. So Carl's chance when he first started of a stroke was roughly 1.2 times a normal person. And his chance of a cataract surgery was around 1.2-fold as well.
But yours was off the charts.
Mine was off the charts, that's right. And the final thing to look at is microvascular complications of diabetes. And this is really things like kidney disease. Kidneys are fed by small capillaries, and they're the first to get damaged by the insulin load.
Erectile dysfunction as well
is another one. So these are all complications related to the small blood vessels. Carl's chance when he was first diagnosed was roughly 2-fold.
So how can we control glucose? What do we do if we know that high insulin is the problem, and if our glucose is too high, we have too much insulin, we obviously have to control glucose.
Glucose flux describes the glucose in our body going up or down during the day. When we eat sugar or starch, we turn that into glucose as part of our digestion, and our glucose level goes up. And then when we do a little bit of exercise, our glucose level goes down. So you can see the little guy here, he runs along and does a little bit of exercise, and his glucose level drops, and then magically it comes back up again. And then he does a little bit more exercise, and then it drops, and then magically it comes back up again. So how is that magic happening? Well, it turns out that our livers actually make glucose. So if we don't eat glucose, we also make it.
And the glucose that we make is an on-demand system called gluconeogenesis.
Mm-hmm. So how is insulin involved? Insulin switches us between using fat or glucose for fuel. So our pancreas secretes insulin when glucose in the blood rises, and insulin shuttles fat into storage, and it shuttles glucose into cells to be burned.
And it also prevents the liver from burning fat, from burning body fat. So it's like you're either burning sugar or you're burning fat, depending on the level of insulin.
Yeah, actually, it prevents the whole body from burning long-chain fatty acids.
Yeah.
So it really is a binary switch between are you running on glucose or are you running on fat. So what happens when a type 2 diabetic eats some carbohydrate? So type 2 diabetics, we've already established they can't lower their too high glucose. That's the clinical definition of a diabetic, somebody whose glucose goes too high and they can't lower it. So we have a little guy running along, he does a little bit of exercise, his glucose goes down, his liver kicks into action and makes a little bit of glucose, and it comes back up again, and then he eats something starchy like an ear of corn. And so what happens is his glucose now starts to rise, and his pancreas tries very hard to slow it down, but for one reason or another, his pancreas is unable to produce sufficient insulin to be able to deal with the problem. So let's try a thought experiment. What if we ate no food that turned into glucose in our blood and just relied on the glucose that we make in our livers?
That's called the ketogenic diet.
It really is. So the little guy's running along and his glucose goes down because he's used some glucose for energy, and now his liver kicks in and makes a little bit more glucose and brings it back up to normal.
So what happened when Carl and Richard stopped eating sugar and starch? As you can see, our A1C went to normal, well below the point of no return.
Yeah. So now we're paying it forward. We are doing a weekly 2 Keto Dudes podcast.
We just did an annual Keto Festival, our first one in New London, Connecticut in 2017.
Yep.
And now we're taking the message to corporate audiences across the world.
Yeah. If we can help your team, let us know.
Contact us by email at dudes@2ketodudes.com. Okay, and now let's move on to part 2.